Yeah, and just as a note to attendees, this, like all future meetings, is public and will be recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, drop off now.
All right, we're rolling.
Okay, the agenda is in the chat link for anybody who got there late. You can open that. We're going to start the meeting with some updates. The first of these items is the SIG creation checklist. I think we're largely in place on this. There is on the Kubernetes project, there is a workflow of what's involved with getting a SIG going. We've got this meeting going, obviously. We've got a Slack channel. We've got a Google Plus mailing list group. In general, to participate, you're expected to join that Google Plus group because the membership in that group is used to gate access to documents. So that is the first step. I think, Fabio, the one thing that maybe still hasn't been published is a YouTube channel with the recordings of these Zoom meetings, but we're working on it.
Yeah, that's correct. We have the meeting, the first meeting uploaded. We haven't had access to the Kubernetes community playlist yet, but we'll have soon.
Yeah. Moving on, just wanted to address there is a code of conduct for this SIG, like all the other SIGs on the Kubernetes project. In the agenda notes, there's a link to it. This is inherited from the Kubernetes project itself. And if you follow that link, you'll discover that that is inherited from the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, which publishes a little bit of code of conduct and also inherits the code of conduct from the Linux Foundation. So I encourage you to go look at that. It addresses things like diversity and a set of rules for how we get along together. Moving on, KubeCon is coming up in about 3 weeks. There was a late ad, just because this VMware SIG is new, of a session for the VMware SIG. The notes have a link to the session details. It's on Thursday, 11:55, I believe, but roughly around noon. And for those of you in this SIG who will be at KubeCon Europe, I hope to see you there. Next item is, how do you submit agenda items? That's simple. You put it in the meeting agenda notes. Once you join the SIG Google Plus group, you will have access to that document. There is a little bit of governance where you add your agenda items as a suggestion, and I think it will be routine that Fabio and I, as administrators of the group, will accept those suggestions. There is a simple level of governance. I've been in some other open source projects where, unfortunately, if you leave things completely wide open for anonymous edit, there is unfortunately the tech equivalent of graffiti people who show up and deface things. So there is a little bit of governance there, but I don't think that we have any intention of applying a lot of editorial judgment to these. There might be limits, and I'd suggest that when you add to the agenda items, you do it at the bottom, kind of a first come, first served basis. Seems fair for situations where we might run out of time during the meeting. Finally, as to updates, we talked a little bit at the last meeting on how you would address issues related to Kubernetes and VMware. And we've made a note there saying that at this time, we're encouraging application of the SIG VMware label on issues in VMware's Kubernetes fork, not in the Kubernetes project itself. And you'll see there already are a collection of issues there, so that might be a good place to look to see if whatever you think you might be encountering already has a workflow of chat that might be addressing the very problem you're seeing. So that's the first line of defense. Of course, if you're on a product, this SIG is specifically for open source issues, but I want to try to avoid getting into product, but a lot of VMware products come with support, and that channel would be open to you if you're a customer. So that's it for the updates. Fabio, I think I'll turn it back to you for the active projects session of the agenda.
Yep. So let me just share my screen on, I have a couple of slides I wanted to present to the group. And I think that's the one. Okay. Is the slide showing up?
Yes, it's fine.
All right. So I guess that one of the major projects that we want to undertake with respect to the SIG is to start working on the refactor for the vSphere Cloud Provider. So today, the vSphere Cloud Provider is probably the largest contribution that VMware has in Kubernetes, and all the code resides in the main Kubernetes/Kubernetes repo. So there's a KEP, or Kubernetes Enhancement Proposal, out there, which is the one that you see linked here, and there's a link to the slides in the meeting notes if you want to follow through that and see the link. So basically, what happens is that there was an initial proposal that was spearheaded by SIG SIG Cluster Lifecycle originally, that wanted to basically take the code and remove the code out from the in-tree Kubernetes Cloud Provider and move that to separate separate repos under Kubernetes org, without doing much to decouple the components. That proposal was superseded by this KEP here. Basically, the idea is still the same. So we want to move. Ideally, what we want to have is we want to have a Kubernetes/Kubernetes repo that has no cloud provider dependent code in it. So it's something that is completely abstract from the underlying platform that Kubernetes is running on. And this is done through some refactor that already happened inside Kubernetes. And then all the various vendors have to work in doing some refactoring and then move the code out of tree. So as you can see here, there's pretty much everybody who has vested interest in having Kubernetes running on the platform is already working on it. So we have AWS, Azure, GCP, and OpenStack having a sub-project inside their own SIGs to work on this project. So right now, the owning SIG for this is the SIG API machinery that has a bi-weekly meeting on Wednesday, 11 a.m. Pacific. There's also a working group that tracks exactly this work, which I'm going to talk about later. And lastly, for this slide, I wanted to just point out that the CCM, which is the Cloud Control Manager, which is this component that is basically enabling you from having the cloud provider out of the tree as a plugin, has been in alpha since 1.6, and it was expected to be moving to beta in 1.10, but that was pushed back. So right now it's still an alpha feature. Also, this key KEP proposal is very recent. So most of the repos have started from scratch. So most of the repos had their entire history reverted. So if you look at, let's say, the cloud provider for Azure, the other three cloud provider for Azure, you're going to see that they basically reverted all the code that they had in there in order to move the governance out to the sub project owned by the Azure SIG, and so they wanted to start from scratch basically. So we're at a very good time to start our effort on this. Just quickly, I wanted to touch on what's required from a cloud provider perspective. So basically, and this is just a short, just a short excerpt from the actual document that is linked in the previous slide. So basically, we have three major components that have touch points with a cloud provider code. We have Kube Controller Manager that has a bunch of control loops that, in four of them specifically, have touch points with the cloud provider code. So the two main ones that I want to call out are Node Controller and Volume Controller, which are probably the ones that we should mostly focus on. Volume Controller also has some interesting connotation regarding the storage provider. So right now, you probably guys know that there's an effort called CSI going on. So the container storage interface, which is ideally working to decouple the storage, attach, detach, create, delete from the Kubernetes main code. And this is also cloud provider dependent. So there's also where it has to be tracked there. Kubelet obviously has several dependencies, including how to discover properties of the node, polling the node to discover new IPs being added. Kube API server has some of them too. The work that I'm talking about right now, and the work that is listed here on the Kubernetes side, has been done already. So there's the last PR for this was merged late 2017. So all this code has been refactored and has been part of Kubernetes pretty much since 1.6. So it's already there and tested. So ideally, the major body work here has to be done on the cloud provider side. So I draft up a straw man for this. There's also a document, a Google document, which I'm going to share in the slide after this one, where I want to track the work that has to be done regarding this cloud provider transition. So first of all, I wanted to call out that we have to establish, given the precedents and what the governance is around this cloud provider refactoring in other SIGs, what we want to do is we want to establish a cloud provider vSphere subproject under the VMware SIG, which is going to own a separate repo called Kubernetes/cloud provider vSphere. Then I want to identify people that can be owners and reviewers of this project. So people that want to invest their time in actually working on the refactor. We have to schedule a weekly meeting to keep track of the progress for this. So I will probably kick off maybe some sort of poll in the SIG VMware channel to see if there is any preference for the time. And also, something that is very important in this case is that we have to establish relationship with all the owning and participant SIGs to this project, which is with our list here, which is API Machinery, which is the owning SIG. There's storage, apps, and network SIGs also participating in this. So we want to make sure that we work across the board and we're part of the discussion going forward, given that this is an effort that basically got restarted not so long ago. And there's also, as I mentioned before, there's also a Kubernetes Cloud Provider Refactoring Working Group, which is meeting weekly on Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific. They're basically tracking the work and getting status updates from all the sub-projects that are working on the refactor. So I guess that this is extremely important for us and for the people that want to participate in this effort to make sure we attend and give status updates back, and we make sure we coordinate the work across the various SIGs and sub-projects that are working on this. Once that is established, we have to scope the work required to create the Cloud Controller Manager for vSphere. We have to scope the impact on the storage and network interfaces, things like CSI that I mentioned before. And then we definitely have to establish targets and milestones. So ideally, we want to start targeting. So this is going to have initially the same release cycle as Kubernetes, because ideally we want to follow this closely until it gets to at least a beta status on Kubernetes. Once that is done, and once this feature, the Cloud Controller Manager feature, graduates from alpha to beta, then we can start have our own release schedule for the cloud provider. Then we ideally I want to just keep the cloud provider in tree for as long as possible. I mean, as long as we feel confident that this new CCM Cloud Controller Manager has 100% functional parity with what is the current in-tree provider. And apparently one of the major blockers today for Kubernetes and having this feature graduate from alpha to beta is that there's no comprehensive end-to-end framework for all these providers. So they're looking at bringing this in hopefully for 1.11, but there's no plan to graduate this feature to beta as of yet. So it's still a work in progress. And then at the very end, once we have everything in place in CCM, the out-of-tree cloud provider is functional and tested and part of, and it's working as expected, then we can move the code from the in-tree provider into the out-of-tree repo. And to wrap up on this, there's a link. Again, I'm gonna put this link on the meeting notes after we're done with this call. There's a document here which is basically listing all the steps on the plan, and there's some written notes about some of those steps that I already took during this week while I was building the strawman. So feel free to add more, and if you want to participate in this effort, feel free to add your name to the list at the beginning of the document, so we can keep track of this work going forward. And let me just see if I can show you what it looks like right now. And this is the document. This is basically a list of people who want to participate here. Please fill out this form, and I'll follow up on the schedule a meeting and the rest of the activities on the Slack channel, on SIG VMware Slack channel. And that's pretty much all I have. I expect to have, for the next meeting, all the, let's say, the housekeeping steps, like creating the sub-project and having the repo set up already completed. And then hopefully we can move forward with starting to refactor the code. And that's all I have, Steve. I don't know if you want to add something to this or if you want to move on. You're muted.
Yeah, Fabio, I think we can move on. The next section would be discussion with community suggested agenda items. The first one would be VMware updates for Kubernetes 1.11. Who's working on what?
Yep, I put that the item on the agenda, Steve. So I'll start this out to highlight the work that we have so far in tree after the 1.10 release. So we've got about 10 different commits right now, which have been applied from folks that are at VMware, and these relate to general bug fixes in Kubernetes and nothing specific to vSphere. I think I'd like to ask the group if anybody is working on something specific to the vSphere provider or the vSphere functionality in Kubernetes. Like, if you want to speak up and make it known what you're working on, we'd be glad to hear about it now. And if there's silence, that's okay too. I think that there's still lots of people that need to know about this call. So I expect that as we have more. Oh, go ahead.
Hey, it's Doug. Sorry, I'm driving, so it might be a little noisy, but I am starting to work on alternative authentication mechanisms. So right now it's username, password only for vSphere in the cloud provider, and that's raised some issues about how to protect that password. And one way to do that is just to get rid of passwords altogether with SSO SAML token authentication. But most of the work I've done so far has just been adding support to that, or that to Go vMommy and then you know, in the next day or two, I plan to start actually digging into BCP, and I'll write up an issue and you know, some more concrete changes that will need to happen, especially with respect to the user-facing stuff, how it would change configuration and so on. So I'll have more. I can give a more detailed overview of that at the next meeting.
Cool. Thank you for that, Doug. Anybody else have anything else they're working on they wanted to highlight? All right. So I think we'll definitely cover this again in some of the future meetings, and as more of our engineers and folks that are contributing engage this meeting, I think we'll hear more. So back to you, Steve.
Yeah, so the next item is expectations for SIG contributors of structure of future meetings. I'm not sure who added this line item, or...
I think I did as well. I was just curious about the structure and how everybody feels the time should be spent. I think today we had says updates and active projects and discussion. And is there anything like structurally that's missing for that project, or do we feel like that's going to make sense in the future?
I think we're gonna probably have more demos in the future, so I think we might have a few lined up already for next meetings. So I guess that from my standpoint, at least, I think it's a good structure so far. We booked an hour every 2 weeks, so I think we can end up eventually filling the entire hour, especially if we have a demo every week. So I think it's I will say that it looks solid to me, at least so far.
Okay.
Okay, that sounds good. The third item on the agenda is the SIG Contributor Experience Roadshow by Tim Pepper. Tim, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, hear you just fine.
Okay. If you could let me share the screen, I'll present a few things.
Okay.
Or alternatively, if you want to click on the link that's there in the agenda.
I just unshared, sorry.
Okay. No worries. I am starting.
Okay,
All
you
right.
see it?
You're seeing it now. So it should say Contribex Roadshow at the top.
Yep, got it.
Okay. The Zoom interface makes it hard to tell quite what's going on sometimes.
Yeah.
So this is kind of an interesting change compared to the normal presentation of this information. So as background, I've been working in the contributor experience SIG for some time, and that SIG's goal is to make it easier for newcomers to the project, but also for existing members of the project to efficiently collaborate in open source. And as a part of that, we've been going out to all the existing SIGs and giving them some updates on some things that are sort of across the project that relate to that. But because this is a new SIG, some of these things maybe won't be quite as relevant, so I'll go through them a little faster. And then some of them I think are going to be much more just planting the seeds for future consideration, where other SIGs are much more actively looking at trying to start doing some of this stuff. So the first set of things is around ensuring that the contributors on the project have a like experience across different parts of the project, different repos, different SIGs. And in particular, there's a few things called out here that are in flight right now. The first one is around the looks good to me label. This is I guess every open source project does this differently, the source code review and merge process. And there's been some complaints about the friction in this. So there's some changes underway, and there have been discussions of this on the Kubernetes dev mailing list. And just kind of FYI, as you all are setting up your owners files for code that you are owning in your repositories, keep this in mind that it'll be something that impacts you. But I suppose for most of this, it'll be just sort of starting from scratch versus a change to how you're already used to doing things. Additionally, just generally label definitions and synchronization across the project is something that's getting attention lately. Some labels that you may have seen used in the past or that have especially become disused lately are going to be removed. Probably not relevant here, the Feta bot, which denotes or tags issues that have become stale and will close them over time. Again, probably not so much of an issue today because you don't have a huge backlog of issues, but if you get to that point where maybe you've opened issues or things for future reference and long-going discussions, there's ways to label those issues to keep them open and not getting automatically closed. Something particularly relevant here, I would say, the help wanted or good first time or good first issue labels are things to consider as you start your SIG and are looking for more contributors. These are things that make it easy for newcomers to understand where they could become contributors. Issue triage is something the more established and very busy SIGs are struggling with. It is a big part of their workload, and there's concerns in the larger project about the time from an issue being open to first response by a SIG, or the time from a PR being open to being merged. And there's always concern that things get lost or stale. So thinking about that as a SIG, there are some existing guidelines in the project, but as you all get up and running, it's something to consider that you aren't going to have an SLA per se, but you give some attention. And then for those of you, I think quite a few of you were on the community call the past hour, there was a walkthrough of some stuff coming from the DevStats site. As SIG leads, you can use that site to try to glean some metrics on how you're doing on these types of things. And you can see how long your open issues are hanging around or how long it takes for PRs to close on average. You can compare with other SIGs, those types of things. And then finally, in this set of bits of information, as these changes are rolling out, whether it's Contribex or steering committee or elsewhere, nobody wants to give the impression of like a heavy hand. This is community, this is collaboration. But at some point, consensus needs to happen because lazy consensus can mean never consensus, just kind of protracted conversation. So the goal is that we get some discussion on mailing lists, relevant stakeholders pulled in, but then sort of a summary notification gets sent out saying, hey, this is what we've decided we're going to go for, unless there's some sort of major objection, but you've got 72 hours to reply now that the discussion seems to have sort of resolved, and then we're going to move forward with this. And then also these discussions will all be echoed on the Thursday community meetings that are 10 a.m. Pacific. So the next set of bits of information, I think you all are already probably intimately familiar with. For existing SIGs, the steering committee has been enhancing the documentation around the SIG governance process and charters. Since you all are just getting off the ground, you know about this, you're setting up your charter, and I think that's pretty obvious. But for the existing ones, this is new work. They have to go back and revisit maybe. But this is really beneficial, again, to the overall project and newcomers trying to understand what are the roles and responsibilities. And that aspect, I think, is maybe important for this SIG as it's new, to both to make sure that you're establishing that so it's clear to your contributor base, but also it could be something that helps you, or maybe you even contribute to other SIGs where you're seeing something for an overlap that's unclear. You can ask them perhaps to update their charter to make it clear. Next, the contributor guide. This has been an area of increased activity over the past quarter or so, and there's more work ongoing. As your SIG is growing and as SIG VMware and VMware employees perhaps come more to Kubernetes, it's something you all could look to as a leadership action perhaps to watch for and notice if people are having problems and documentation missing, things like that. And again, because this is open source, it's all stuff that you can PR, and these can make for easy first-time contributors or a path for somebody to sort of get their feet wet, make sure they've signed the CLA, get their first PR into the project, just a simple update to docs. The next big section is mentoring, and I feel partly like some of this might be worth just glossing over in this forum. Most of this mentoring these activities have two focuses. One is growing the community base in existing SIGs that are starting to struggle under load as the project grows and accelerates as well. For this SIG, that's maybe not quite as relevant, but it's something to think about for the future as the SIG grows and as you bring on more people, have more contribution happening. Think about how you grow and curate your community base and do active mentoring. Bring on new contributors, bring on new and more reviewers and owners, and sort of build up that support hierarchy so that it's not all falling on a few people and they're getting burned out. The other aspect of the mentoring then is just new people coming into the Kubernetes project. This SIG might be an entry point. If there are existing people out there in the world who are familiar with VMware and see this SIG and think, oh, hey, I'm curious about Kubernetes, maybe this SIG is my entry point. Those might be places where you have the opportunity to do some mentoring on the broader Kubernetes project, even beyond just the SIG's particular focus charter. And
is there a place to direct them to, Tim?
I was
Because
just about to
think
say,
this is a great vector, but probably a lot of the
there's-
other cloud-related are too, and
yeah,
could be
there are links in here to specific information, but that was about to be the next thing I say. And where you don't have bandwidth or it doesn't feel like your core competency for the SIG, send the folks over to the contributor experience SIG.
Thanks.
The next topic, Slack maintenance. This is a good one for this SIG. Currently in SIG VMware, unless it's changed in the last minute, there is nothing pinned in the channel. Slack allows you to pin documents in the channel. So things that you might consider pinning there are information on the regular meetings, the agenda document, the Zoom info, the Google group URL, some basic things like that. At the point that you have your charter established or some roadmap activities for the coming period, pin those on the channel so that when somebody comes new to the channel, they're not necessarily needing to scroll back through an infinite amount of information to find the most relevant topics of information, that they're just pinned at the top of the channel there.
Okay, that sounds great. I'll take that as an action item.
Okay. And then finally, user office hours. There's a link there in the document. Oh, and this document is shared with the SIG, so any member of the SIG should be able to click on the document link in the meeting agenda and view it, and then click on the links themselves as well. But user office hours is basically a way for people to ask questions, and we need to always have a stable of contributors and experienced existing people contributing to fielding those questions. So anybody in the SIG, if you're interested in doing that, it's a great way to do outreach. It gives your SIG some visibility as well, and it's a great way to give back to the overall project. And that was it. I guess the final bullet there, definitely give Contribex feedback on this stuff. We don't want to be viewed as sort of like the police. We're driving process down everybody's throats on how they must do things. We're really just trying to be collaborative in a central point where we can note these process enhancements that are beneficial to all, but recognizing that that takes a lot of feedback and discussion and then phasing things out. So you'll often see process changes that are first trialed actually on the community repo that Contribex owns, just to see how it goes. If you're interested in any of that, let Contribex know. You could participate in some of these early actions perhaps, but otherwise keep an eye out for the conversations and engage, and let the community know if you feel like changes that they're making negatively impact you, or also give your kind of yes please if it's something that you feel like would be beneficial. It's great to have those conversations. And that was it. I appreciate your time.
I've got a question, Tim, if you have time to stick around for just a quickie. I'm kind of curious because there's been a recent move in some areas of the Kubernetes project to move things out of tree, storage and cloud provider specifically. And I'm thinking that some of these Kubernetes governance standards, probably the intent might be to still have them pertain even though they went out of the Kubernetes repo, you know.
Yes, so I think this is an area where the discussion is ongoing and the documentation maybe is not quite summing up the state of things because of that. But if you look back historically over the last 6 or maybe even more months, you'll see discussion, or you might hear discussion around splitting the monolith, and that's referring to things moving out of tree so that the Kubernetes repo is smaller. There's a lot of work underway to define what that actually means, and then mechanisms along with that so that so that things are still discoverable. You want newcomers or anybody involved in the project to understand, hey, where is the repo for this little thing that I'm trying to understand, or which SIG owns this repo that I've stumbled upon. So as that split happens, there's ongoing work to make sure that everything is still discoverable and visible, and that there is coherency across the broader project. And the main thing, I guess, to take away from it is that just because some repo isn't under the Kubernetes org or that some code isn't in the Kubernetes repo, that doesn't mean it's not part of Kubernetes. And this is maybe a little different than other things like OpenStack, for example, where had been this more formal idea of a big tent and inclusion or not. So things are a little more loose here and amorphous, but there's YAML files, for example, that say SIGs and repos and track what's what and where. And the intent is to have these processes common across all of those, so people don't feel like they're in a foreign land when they pop into one of these side repos as things split apart.
Yeah, it would seem obviously that things like the code of conduct doesn't go away and it becomes the Wild West and arbitrary as you leave the.
Yep. For example, code of conducts, those are there, and that even before this, code of conduct was something that varied a bit across repos, and an effort was made to make sure that they were all commonized and linked back to the code of conduct for the project. So yeah, there's things like that.
So as we were setting up this SIG, I came across the workflow that suggested creating an ownership file for a project that the SIG was, shall we say, authoritative on. But if things move out of tree, is there any documented procedure or policy for how that gets handled with regard to the relationship to a SIG?
Expectation is that you'd still have owners files for mapping humans or lists or aliases to ownership of code within the repo and the repo subdirectories. At the level above that, which repos are tied to which SIGs, there are YAML files that are tracking that, and that stuff is a little bit in flux, but this comes back to having test automation and things like that. The PROW, I guess is not quite the right word, automation on GitHub, things like that. Those tools need to understand who's who, what's what, and all of that then backs into YAML files. And as that changes, yeah, docs will be updated and word will go out to SIGs. You all will probably have it a little bit easier because you're starting fresh around when this is all happening. So the docs that you're following, I think, should be more or less up to date for the moment.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tim. I think the next item on discussion was discuss current status and improvement of zone support in VCB by Michael. Michael, are you on?
I'm on, hey. Yeah, so let me give you a little bit of context. The links are in the agenda, so which links to a Google Groups entry that I posted. And the VCP zone support, or not supporting zone awareness, has been an open issue for a while now, which is being tracked on the VMware Kubernetes repo. And the challenges there are that if you set up or stand up a Kubernetes cluster on vSphere, you have to make sure that you tell vSphere and the nodes, the Kubernetes scheduler, essentially, where the rack or cluster failure domains are in order to have high availability, because otherwise chances are high that some of the nodes could land up on the same ASXi host and potentially being disrupted during a host failure. So other cloud providers solve this with having the cloud provider support the zone interface, which we currently don't. And I just wanted to use this SIG to bring back attention on this issue, because I've worked with a lot of customers where actually this has been a challenge. And fortunately, I had Doug supporting me in writing some GoVC extensions to programmatically fix that during cluster deployment. But I think it would be great to have it in the VCP to have a better out-of-the-box experience.
Okay, thanks. Fabio, since you talked a bit before about the dealing with the cloud provider, maybe we can, do you think this might be appropriate to cover as that goes on, or?
Yeah, I think this actually fits in with some work that I know that Anthony is doing around affinity and anti-affinity on the host. So I guess that this problem is, from my understanding, just glancing over the problem, looks like there's an issue where nodes are being deployed on the same physical host, which in turn means that if there's a physical host goes down, you're basically losing more than one node. Is that correct, Michael?
Yeah, exactly. As well as if you have DRS enabled in a cluster, then there's no DRS rules right now which prohibit VMs from being co-located on the same host. And this basically just disturbs the Kubernetes scheduler because he can't really be aware of anti-affinity or affinity rules.
So let me see if I can understand this. So I think there's two sides of this. One is at deployment of the Kubernetes nodes, right? The deployer could be completely aware of how it wants to schedule these, Kubernetes worker nodes and make sure that they're on top of unique, physical hosts. And that's like a deployer task to make that happen. And then you'd have your DRS policy in effect to ensure that you don't have hosts commingling. And then there's another level which says, all right, if you can guarantee that your hosts are on your worker nodes are on different hosts, then you'd have your policy that says, like, affinity-wise, keep these pods off of the same worker node. Is that summarizing it, or am I going the wrong direction?
Yes, no, that's right. And maybe something to add would be, if you like the zone interface basically publishes some well-known labels to each kubelet, meaning the host name, the rack, the region, the zone, whatever. And this is something that I think we should also expose to the kubelet, so that actually something is already also exposed to the kubelet and not just underneath the Kubernetes infrastructure, meaning vSphere. So it's kind of on both levels, but you were right. It's also a deployment task.
To the best of my knowledge, Kubernetes scheduler actually, if you specify affinity and anti-affinity rules in the host side, and the scheduler will basically look at the topology key to see, like, its affinity to the node level, or its zone level, or its host level, or whatever it is. And
Yes.
I'm not aware of this cloud private API. I think this basically say when the node starts, which zone does this node belongs to, and whenever the customer specify affinity rule on the zone level, and this will kick in and do the right thing. Is that correct, Michael?
Well, kind of, yeah. So you're right with the topology key, but if you do not publish those labels, because the topology key, if I recall correctly, per default is the well-known labels being published. If you don't publish them by the zone interface, then the Kubernetes scheduler won't know which node belongs to which zone. So basically, this information is not added as a label to the node, and so it's not known to the Kubernetes scheduler.
So my understanding here is that there's possibly a problem of information not being bubbled up
Yes,
into the from the cloud provider into Kubernetes.
exactly.
Like I would say information from the actual physical node that the VM is running on,
Exactly.
and possibly there's also the affinity anti-affinity DRS rule problem, which
Yes.
will cause nodes being collocated, without Kubernetes acknowledging the fact that these nodes are being moved.
Exactly.
So I guess this is a
think it's
valid issue.
I think it's for
Yeah, right.
public cloud.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, for AWS, like this public cloud, I can understand what Zoom means, but for VMware.
Yes, the question is, what is the zone, right? So with the customers that I worked with, some of them had basically a stretch cluster across 2 data centers. And so within a cluster defined their zones, being 2 separate data centers. Some of them had Kubernetes nodes deployed onto different clusters with redundant kind of infrastructure, etc. So we have to, first of all, define exactly what a zone is. And this could be different in customer scenarios, which I think you can always change, as you said, with the topology key, but we should come up with the same default.
Yeah, this is really interesting. Anthony, do you want to talk about the prototype that you just got done, your Kube we'll call it quote unquote kubedrs project that you're working on?
Yeah, Michael might be aware of this because we talked about this a lot in the KubeCon Austin. And basically, it's a scheduled extension, so that the extension talks to both the Kubernetes API server and the vSphere, and combine knowledge of the hypervisor and kube-scheduler on the container side, so that it can do affinity, anti-affinity better on the host side. So basically, when you specify an anti-affinity, for example, between two pods, and those two pods on different should be scheduled on different hosts. Like, what I mean host is the physical host, so that when the host goes down, both pod, one of the pods can survive on some other host. So this is the POC right now. I think Clint is working on moving. It's on my private repo, and I'm adding some docs into it, so that I think Clint is working on moving it to the VMware organization. Is that right?
Yep, we got to go through the process of getting it open source so that people can take a look at it. But I think it's fundamentally a little bit different than what Michael's describing, because it's like, Michael's describing kind of a bottom-up approach where we're supplying information, or we're actually working directly with the DRS scheduler in vSphere or vCenter to actually set that affinity policies and set our quote-unquote zones, and then bubble that information up to Kubernetes so that the scheduler can naturally take advantage of it. And then your approach is a little opposite of that, where it's a top-down, where we're saying, regardless of what's happening under the covers, just make sure you understand what hosts these cube worker nodes are on, and don't schedule pods to the same host. It's really interesting, and I don't know at this point the intersection of those two concepts, what's the right thing to do. But I think that we need to look closely at this, because I think it's a problem that we should solve for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, if we're done with this, the final item that's sitting on the agenda is the proposal for GitHub issues in Kubernetes for cloud provider and volume plugin bugs.
Hold on a sec, Steve. Are we done with that? Does anybody else have any comments on that work? Does anybody want to get actively engaged? Like, do we want to set up a call to discuss that further between anyone? Michael? Anthony?
Yeah, I'd be happy. Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in a call. Yeah.
I think, yeah, it's worth another call, because there are situations we have with customers where Kubernetes is viewed as a workload and the DRS policies are handled by a corporate-wide policy. So there may be situations where you're forced to use certain DRS rules, and if we're not exposing that up to Kubernetes in a sensible way, it's going to break. So it's definitely worth a further discussion here.
Okay. Anthony, do you want to set up, maybe we'll add this to the meeting notes as a sub-bullet item, but let's set up a public Zoom call to further discuss this. Does that sound fair?
I'll follow up later.
Yeah, so let's set out an email to the Google group and say we're going to start a meeting to chat more about DRS alignment to Kubernetes.
Yeah, sure.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, Steve, sorry about that. Yeah,
so finally, your item, Clint, for GitHub issues.
Yep. So we introed the call at the very top. Steve said, if we're filing new issues, let's start to use the SIG VMware tag under the VMware/Kubernetes fork. And that's been the existing process that the teams have used to start tracking the GitHub issues. Something that was interesting that Tim said when we're reviewing the dev stats portion. Dev stats is a tool that helps everyone track the activity within the project within Kubernetes, and you can go there and see all kinds of. You can slice and dice the data and get some great information from it. And if we continue using our forked version of Kubernetes to start to track issues regarding vSphere, we don't allow ourselves to actually take part in those tools because they're not tracked. They're not, the information is not recorded and rolled up through dev stats. And so Tim and I had a call this last week, and what we decided is that we're going to work on a proposal, and we want to get everybody's feedback on that to figure out where the right place is to actually collaborate on the GitHub issues. And there were a couple of key things, I'd say. One, there's the issues and just discussing bugs and fixes, et cetera, that the SIG's involved with. And we got to figure out where the right place to do that is, whether it's in this fork or in the Kubernetes project. And then the second thing is, if we have this fork, maybe we use it for our CI/CD. So as we check in stuff, we actually have vSphere actively being tested against the builds or different pull requests we have that impact the vSphere cloud provider. So anyways, there's a discussion, there's a proposal that I'm planning on writing up and working on. So I'm hoping to get other folks involved on that so we can get a consensus and we can start having a consistent place that we log all of our GitHub issues. Does that sound good to everybody? Any comments there?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now with having basically our own label across all the Kubernetes repos, because the label is actually spread across all the repos on the Kubernetes org, and the fact that as you said, there's tools around tracking issues over the Kubernetes org. There's tracking it, and also the easiest way for people to reach out to people working on Kubernetes and VMware is through the Kubernetes organization, basically. So I think as you said, for tracking issues is probably the best way forward now that we have our own label and our own way to address issues that are specific to VMware in the Kubernetes community.
Tim, do you have any thoughts on that? Any more comments?
One of the things I'm curious to see over time is when the monolith gets broken apart, how far away repos are able to be and still be captured by the automation. Initially, my impression has been that they could be fairly far, but potentially one hiccup here for this SIG would be that the VMware org might have to allow access, like write access to this automation tooling, which could potentially be a problem for the ownership of the VMware org.
But you made a good point, Tim. You made a good point on this. I think the problem here is that we're lacking the tools to do that. I mean, it would be great to have a federated way to, let's say, keep labels synced across multiple organizations, like having VMware, the VMware organization having their own, repos that are, maybe, synced with a main Kubernetes repo in terms of labels and things like that. But I think we don't have those tools yet. So I think that
right now, the test infra folks have scripts that will push labels, for example, out to, or a labels.yaml file out to repos, but that gets tricky depending on how it spans orgs. So it may be that part of that becomes pushing where possible, or orgs that are wanting to be a part watch and pull. And that's something that happens anyway. Like if you have a GitHub fork, you're that doesn't necessarily mean that you are something distinct in terms of always being separate. Like the simpler interpretation of the word fork, like you've gone your own way. GitHub expects you to have forks. Like there are however many, probably tens of thousands of forks of Kubernetes. So that is normal, but somebody who's done that might want to opt into being part of that bigger umbrella, and that it's going to take enhancing, I think, on the infrastructure and the tooling, but there are folks that are actively looking at that.
Cool.
Okay, I think we've reached the end of the items on the agenda, and we're also near the end of the hour here. So unless anybody's got a last minute ad, I think we'll call it a day.
All right.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for coming, and see you in a couple of weeks.
All right, thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks,
Thank
folks.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.